Welcome back to the world of Tash Mia. Today we're doing BDSM 101. So let's get cracking. First term, how could we forget BDSM? So BDSM stands for bondage, discipline, sadism, and masochism. Now, probably some of those terms you're familiar with, but maybe others not so much. Bondage, I think most people would understand. It's the art of being tied up. So think ropes, things like shudder, which essentially means the Japanese art of rope tying. Think tape, think handcuffs, think St. Andrew's crosses, all are different types of bondage. Next, we've got discipline, the art of obedience and being able to follow instructions and be able to practice self-discipline in whatever form that means to you for BDSM. The next, we have sadism. So I've already kind of mentioned that I'm a bit of a sadist myself, which is someone that enjoys inflicting pain on someone else consensually. And last one is masochism. So if you've got someone who's a sadist, the opposite to that would be a masochist, which means it's the person who enjoys receiving the pain consensually, once again. So there's our first big term we need to learn, what BDSM actually stands for. Next, what is a dominatrix? I did mention briefly in our first episode, but I want to go over it again just in case you missed that one. And the dom is the top. It's the person who's leading the scene, the person who's taking on that power role, the person who's guiding the other person who's the submissive in the scene as to what is going to happen, again, consensually. Then we have the submissive or the bottom, and they're the person being led by the dominant role. So they're the person in the scene that's following orders, or is that more of the receiver in the scene, I would say. However, I don't want people to get confused about the power exchange between a dom and a sub. That, of course, is the agreed and negotiated power exchange, but people often mistake that the power is all held within the dominant role, which is actually a bit of a misconception. And the power is essentially, most people would argue, held by the submissive, which is the person who is allowing these activities and the scene to take place. At the end of the day, they're the ones who's going to say yay or nay to how a scene goes. So I just want to make that clear. While a role might be called dominant, it doesn't mean that all the power is held with them. The next term, or I'd say character you might be wanting to play, is a switch. Now, a switch is someone who goes between a dominant and submissive role. Now, this could be within the same scene, or as I've mostly seen it practiced professionally and socially, it's generally someone that in one scene might play a dominant role and then in another scene play a submissive role. Generally, again, I do see it more that they'd be a dominant role with a particular play partner or a particular setting, and then they would be in a submissive role with a different play partner or a different setting. However, I have heard of couples who do interchange these roles and who do it quite successfully. So that's just another way you can think about dominant submissive, is someone that also takes on both roles. Another term you might hear in the scene is a lifestyler. So a lifestyler is someone who lives a DNS relationship, so a dom-sub relationship, 24/7, which is another term you might hear, a 24/7er. And that's someone that doesn't just practice the power dynamic exchange within a scene itself. It's someone that lives it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that could be someone who, let's just take for instance, a husband and wife. One, let's say the female is the dominant in the relationship and the male is the submissive. Well, they live that lifestyle every day from morning to night, and they would have their own rituals and protocols on how they conduct their lives. You would often see these people wearing commitment pieces, maybe a collar is the most famous one. So when you're playing socially, which I do in my sessions myself, a collar goes on as long as it's been agreed to, and that signifies the start of a scene. And when a collar comes off, that signifies the end of the scene. With lifestylers, they will often have some sort of piece of jewelry or equipment or garment that signifies this power dynamic exchange, such as it could be a ring, it could be a necklace, it could be a bracelet, it could be a cuff, it could be a myriad of things, but normally they'll have something that signifies that they're in that DS dynamic. I also just wanted to run over again the difference between a kink and a fetish. As I said, a kink is an umbrella term for activities practiced, and that includes things such as BDSM, but it can also include other things such as swinging, voyeurism. We mentioned foot fetish in one of the podcasts, but there's also a thing called a fetish in particular. Now, the difference between something just being your kink and something being a fetish. So let's go back to our foot fetish example. If you have a foot fetish, in order for you to become aroused, you would need some sort of foot somewhere involved. That would mean you have a fetish. If you have a foot kink, that means feet are one of the things that may or may not arouse you, but it's not essential for you to be aroused. So the difference between something being your kink and something being someone's fetish is that element of it must be present in order for that person to get aroused. Another term that's really important is to come across, we talked about boundaries, negotiation, consent, all those things. There's principles of play that kind of encompass these ideologies. The one that I personally practice under, and you'll probably hear a lot, is RAC, which means risk-aware consensual kink. Next concept I want to move on to is safe words. Most people probably have heard of safe words. I know everyone seems to shout spaghetti at me every time I say safe word. But safe words basically are a word you need to have pre-negotiated before a scene in order to stop play during a scene. Now, I personally use traffic light system, which is quite a popular one. No one really says green, which should mean go. But the most important part of that is orange and red. I like to have two words, and the reason is orange means I'm near my limit, and red means stop, I'm at my limit. I've maybe even gone beyond it. At an orange during a scene, you don't have to necessarily stop play. The dominant can then back off an activity, change activity, whatever kind of has been negotiated of what happens when there's an orange. But if someone calls a red, that means we break scene and we stop and we have to check in. And there's nothing wrong with calling a red. And I really encourage my clients and submissives to use their safe words. And if someone uses a safe word, they're actually rewarded and they're never punished for it. But I always try to say to them, please try and tell me when you get to an orange, because at red, there's not much I can do except break scene. But with an orange, we can back off and we can kind of like keep the scene going. I do shy away from people using the word stop. The reason why safe words exist is because, as you could imagine, in a lot of BDSM scenes, there's a lot of role play, and a lot of that role play may involve the word stop, but they don't mean stop. They mean like, oh, you're hurting me. Stop it. But they don't want you to stop. So that's why I would always suggest never to use a word stop or something similar, to make sure it's a word that has a specific meaning. Hence why probably people use spaghetti a lot of the time. So I think another concept that people are always interested in, and I've certainly used this word a lot myself, is what is a scene? We say scene all the time when you're in scene. So scene essentially is the word for the duration of play. So as I said, the way I like to start my scenes is with the collaring of my submissive, as long as they've agreed to that they don't mind being collared. And the way I end a scene is the removal of that collar and any other cuffs or restraints that may have been placed on them during a scene. A scene is kind of like a story, I'd say to people. You can just start playing. I'm not saying you have to sit down and write a mini narrative, But certainly when I'm going into my scenes with my clients, especially if they're clients I've already seen, when it's a new client, it's a little bit different. Generally, I would have thought about the scene that we're going to do that day. And I've written a little narrative. It might not be written down on paper, but at least I've thought about it. And a scene, like a story, has a beginning. It has the crescendo. It has the peak. And then you've also got to come down. So I really would encourage people to try and think of their playtime or their scenes in a narrative kind of way. Start off soft, start off slow, build it up, get there gradually, think of where you want to end up, get to that crescendo, but then make sure you kind of build it down, come down back slowly to earth. And I think a really big part of how you get back down to earth is aftercare. But before I go into aftercare, I'm actually going to talk about dom high and sub high and dom drop and sub drop. So when you're in a scene, as you can imagine, you're going through your little narrative and everyone's in their element. People can get into a different transient headspace. And this headspace has often been studied in the realms of submissive space, so subspace. And what they think is happening is that there's a release of hormones, probably endorphins, mixed with adrenaline. And that gets you into this kind of like sub-high, as we said, this kind of meditative, transient, altered state. The way it kind of looks often when someone's in subspace is they're quite, I'd say, floaty. They might actually be quite quiet. And when I actually started professionally doming, I thought that meant someone wasn't enjoying the session. And actually it was quite the reverse. They were in their subspace. They had entered this meditative-like space. And essentially subspace is very similar to what happens to our brains during meditation. Your brain is switching off, which is why a lot of people who practice BDSM use it as a stress relief. And studies have in fact shown that about 40% of people who practice BDSM do it for stress relief properties. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the sub high is. So you've also got a dom high, which is similar. You're entering this altered transit state, but it's a bit of a different state. And how I would describe it best is when you enter, I don't know if you've heard this term used, especially in the work sphere, is when you enter your flow. So when you're really on fire, you're in your element. And the characteristics that normally come up with that is that you are very confident. You're very task orientated and you're in the zone. And that would be the best way, I think, to describe what the dom high is. And you can get quite an euphoric rush from feeling that way. And I think everyone can probably think of a time in their life, something that they're really good at and they've just done it so well that day, and you leave and you're freaking rocking it. So that's what a dom high is. Now, if you think about if something has a high, then at the other end of the scale, you're going to have something called a low. And that's what we call sub drop and dom drop. Now, with sub drop, especially because we've had all this release of endorphins and adrenaline, you can imagine that once the scene ends, there can be a crash in these hormones and they could enter quite a depressive state. And it doesn't actually always happen straight away. It could happen the next day. It could even happen the next week. So we have to be very aware of these drop in what they think are the hormones and this changed emotional state that might arrive post a scene. And the way we correct that in BDSM and look out after that is the thing that I just mentioned called aftercare, which is one of the most important things you need to learn about BDSM and practicing responsibly. So aftercare is what happens after a scene. And it can take on a myriad of forms. There's no prescription of how to do aftercare. And it also will change from scene to scene. So, for example, an aftercare might be running a warm bath for yourself, having some nice music in the background, bringing yourself back to, ground, might be walking in a park. There's all different things that you could do. Some people like to do it alone, and some people like to do it with the dominant partner. It could be cuddles on the bed, kisses. It could even be intercourse if that's something that has led on to that. It doesn't always have to be though. So for me as a professional, it's not always possible that I know the exact aftercare of a client because they might not know what their aftercare is. But I always make sure if they don't have a specific one, after a scene, I untie them if they've got restraints. As I said, I take off their collar, and also my persona changes. I drop my role really as Tash Mia, and I take a bit more of a personal approach with them. I'm quite soft and gentle. Might give them a touch on the shoulder, and I'll guide them into the bathroom where I hand them a nice fluffy towel and I make them have a shower. And then we'll have a little chat afterwards about how the scene went sometimes. Sometimes if people are still buzzing from a scene, which is often, it's not the best thing to go straight into let's critique the scene. Might just have a chat about what are you up to this weekend? And that just helps bring them back down to what I say planet Earth before I send them out back on their way. And inadvertently, there's also dom drop. So I myself have experienced dom drop. And again, it's when I've had often either very intense sessions or sessions where I've felt really in my element and it's just gone so well and I'm super euphoric. So I have to make sure that I have an aftercare plan for myself. So you, if you're a dom, need to make sure you have that in place. And again, it can be anything you want it to be. Mine personally is after my client leaves, I take off all my clothing and my high boots from my session. I then do the cleanup, actually without clothes on, because that's how I feel really comfortable. I clean up after the session, nice and slowly, really nice and calm. I change the music because during my sessions, I have a specific playlist, which is much more upbeat, fast paced. And I put on some calming, more slow beat music. And then once I've cleaned it up, I get into my shower at the studio. I have my own specific fluffy towel. I use that towel for myself and myself only. And I have a nice warm shower and I kind of wash off Tash Mia. And that's my aftercare. So hopefully that answers some of your curiosities and questions about what all this BDSM terminology means. I know there's probably still heaps out there because there's many acronyms in this world. Let me know what they are and I'd be happy to do another episode and answer those questions for you. Next show, we're going to be talking pain, punishment, punishment. So get your kink on.